Welcome to part 3 of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, as reimagined in the style of Kurt Vonnegut. Thank you for listening to this episode of Classic Books Reimagined. If you are enjoying this book, please take a moment to like, share, or subscribe to this channel to get notified when new content posts. If there is a classic book you would like to hear reimagined in the style of a modern author, please leave it in the comments.
Chapter 23, The Royal Nonsuch Debacle.
The mob swarmed toward Sherburne's house, whooping and raging like a bunch of drunken cowboys on a payday spree. They trampled over everything in their path, kids screaming and running ahead, women hanging out of windows, and every tree full of curious onlookers. Chaos was the order of the day, with women crying and kids hollering, while men, always slow to the game, stood there gawking like cows at a passing train. They gathered in front of Sherburne's place, packed so tight you'd think they were sardines in a can. Shouts of, "Tear down the fence! Tear down the fence!" echoed as they started ripping and tearing like wild animals. Down went the fence, and the mob began to surge forward. Just then, Sherburne steps out onto his porch roof, double-barrel shotgun in hand, looking as calm as a man sipping lemonade on a Sunday afternoon. The noise died down faster than a fire in a rainstorm. He stood there silent, staring down at them like they were a bunch of school kids caught stealing apples. His gaze cut through the crowd, making people squirm and look away. Finally, Sherburne chuckled, but it was the kind of laugh that makes your skin crawl, like nails on a chalkboard. He said slow and scornful, "The idea of you lynching anybody? It's a joke. You think you've got the guts to lynch a man? Just because you can tar and feather some poor cast-out woman, you think you can handle a man? A man's safe in your hands, as long as it's daylight and you're not behind him." The crowd fell silent, their bravado evaporating like morning dew. Sherburne continued, "Do I know you? I know you all too well. The average man's a coward. In the North, he lets anyone walk over him and goes home to pray for a humble spirit. In the South, one man can stop a stage full of men and rob the lot. Your newspapers tell you you're brave and you believe it. But why don't your juries hang murderers? Because they're afraid of getting shot in the back by the murderer's friends in the dark. So they acquit, and then you cowards go lynching in the night, masked and anonymous." He paused, surveying the now subdued mob. "Your mistake was not bringing a man with you and not coming in the dark with your masks. You brought part of a man, Buck Harkness, there. Without him to start you, you'd have taken it out in bluster. You don't like trouble and danger, but you follow a half-man shouting, 'Lynch him,' because you're afraid to be called cowards. You're pitiful. A mob without a leader is beneath contempt. Now go home. If any lynching's to be done, it'll be in the dark, Southern style, and they'll bring their masks and a real man. Now leave, and take your half-man with you." With that, he cocked his gun. The crowd broke apart, scattering like roaches when the lights come on, and Buck Harkness slunk away, looking smaller than ever. With the lynching foiled, I wandered over to the circus, slipping in under the tent to save my precious gold piece. It was a grand sight, with riders parading in, men in their skivvies, women in dazzling outfits that probably cost a fortune, all glitter and glam. The performances were stunning. The riders, graceful as swans, pranced around the ring. The ringmaster cracked his whip, and the clown kept the crowd in stitches with quick-witted jabs that came faster than lightning. I marveled at how anyone could be so funny so fast. Then a drunk staggered into the ring, insisting he could ride as well as anyone. The show paused as they tried to drag him out, but he wouldn't have it. The crowd hooted and hollered, and the ringmaster, seeing no other way, let him mount the horse. The drunk clung to the horse's neck as it bucked and spun. The crowd roared with laughter, tears streaming down their faces. But suddenly the drunk sat up, grabbed the bridle, and stood on the horse as it galloped around the ring. He stripped off suit after suit, 17 in all, revealing a dazzling costume beneath. He was one of the performers playing the crowd for fools. The ringmaster's face turned ashen as the crowd realized they'd been had. But they loved it, cheering and laughing even harder. I felt a bit sheepish for being duped, but couldn't deny the performance was brilliant. That night, we had our show, but only 12 people showed up, just enough to cover costs. They laughed at the wrong times, and the Duke fumed. By the end, everyone had left, except one boy who'd fallen asleep. The Duke declared Arkansas folks weren't fit for Shakespeare. They wanted low comedy or worse. The next morning, he made new handbills. At the courthouse, for 3 nights only, the world-renowned tragedians, David Garrick, the younger, and Edmund Kean, the elder. In their thrilling tragedy of the King's Camelopard or the Royal Nonsuch, admission 50 cents. Ladies and children not admitted. There, said the Duke. If that line doesn't fetch them, I don't know Arkansas. And so, with our new lowbrow bait, we set out to dupe another crowd, hoping to turn our luck around in the grand American tradition of fleecing the rubes.
Chapter 24. Sold. Royal Ruses and Jim's Homesick Blues.
Well, the King and the Duke spent all day rigging up a stage, a curtain, and a row of candles for footlights. By nightfall, the house was packed tighter than a politician's wallet. When there wasn't an inch of standing room left, the Duke quit playing doorman, snuck around the back, and sauntered onto the stage. He made a grand speech about the upcoming tragedy, claiming it was the most thrilling spectacle since sliced bread. He gushed over Edmund Kean the Elder, who was supposedly playing the lead role. When he had everyone's expectations wound tighter than a cheap watch, he rolled up the curtain. Out pranced the king, on all fours, stark naked. He was painted from head to toe in a riot of colors, looking like a psychedelic zebra. The crowd erupted in laughter. When the king finally scampered off the stage, they roared and clapped, demanding an encore. And another. It would have made a cow laugh to see the antics of that old fool. The Duke finally let the curtain down, bowed, and announced that the great tragedy would only be performed 2 more nights due to pressing engagements in London, where seats were already sold out at Drury Lane. He thanked the audience and asked them to tell their friends to come and see the show. 20 people hollered, "What? Is it over? Is that all?" The Duke confirmed it, and the crowd went wild. They yelled, "Sold," and started for the stage, looking like they wanted to tar and feather our tragedians. But a big, fine-looking man jumped on a bench and shouted, "Hold on. Just a word, gentlemen." They stopped to listen. "We are sold, mighty badly sold, but we don't want to be the laughing stock of this whole town." "No, sir, we'll go out quietly, talk up the show, and sell the rest of the town. Then we'll all be in the same boat. Ain't that sensible?" "You bet it is. The judge is right," everybody shouted. So they slinked out and advised everyone to see the splendid show. Next day, the town was buzzing about how amazing the performance was. The house was packed again that night, and we swindled that crowd just as easily. When we got back to the raft, we had a feast. By midnight, we backed out, floated down the middle of the river, and hid 2 miles below town. On the 3rd night, the house was crammed again. This time, it was full of people who had already seen the show twice. I stood by the Duke at the door and noticed everyone going in had bulging pockets or something tucked under their coats. It wasn't perfume they were packing. I smelled rotten eggs, cabbages, and the unmistakable scent of dead cats. I couldn't stand it, so I slipped away. The Duke handed a quarter to some guy to watch the door, and we headed for the stage entrance. The minute we turned the corner and were in the dark, he whispered, "Walk fast now, and then run like the devil's after you." We did just that, hitting the raft at the same time and gliding downstream, silent as the grave. The poor king was in for it with the audience. But soon enough, he crawled out from under the wigwam and asked, "How'd it go this time, Duke?" He hadn't even gone to town. We didn't light a lamp until we were 10 miles downstream. When we finally did, we had a laugh at how we duped the crowd. The Duke boasted, "Greenhorns, flatheads." I knew the first house would stay quiet and let the rest get roped in. I knew they'd lay for us the third night, thinking it was their turn. Well, it was underscore their turn. I'd love to know what they did with their opportunity. They had plenty of provisions. Those rapscallions made $465 in 3 nights. I'd never seen money hauled in like that before. Later, when they were snoring, Jim said, "Don't it surprise you how these kings carry on, Huck?" "No," I said, "it don't." "Why don't it, Huck?" "Because it's in the breed. They're all alike." "But Huck, our kings are real rapscallions." "Well, that's what I'm saying. All kings are mostly rapscallions, far as I can tell." "Is that so?" "Read about them, you'll see. Look at Henry VIII. This one's a Sunday school teacher compared to him. And Charles II, Louis XIV and XV, James II, Edward II, Richard III, and a slew more. You should have seen old Henry VIII in his prime. He was a real blossom. He married a new wife every day and chopped off her head the next morning. He did it as casually as ordering breakfast. 'Fetch up Nell Gwynn,' he'd say. Next morning, chop off her head. And they'd do it. 'Fetch up Jane Shore,' he'd say. Same thing. He kept this up until he had 1,001 tales and put them all in a book called the Domesday Book. You don't know kings, Jim, but I do. This old rip of ours is one of the cleanest I've come across. Henry VIII wanted to start trouble with this country, so he threw all the tea in Boston Harbor overboard and declared independence. He suspected his father, the Duke of Wellington, so he drowned him in a butt of Malmsey like a cat. If he found money lying around, he took it. If he promised to do something and you didn't watch him, he'd do the opposite. If he opened his mouth, he'd lose a lie every time. If we had him instead of our kings, he'd have fooled that town much worse. I don't say our kings are lambs, but they're nothing compared to that old ram. Kings are kings, and you've got to make allowances. They're a rough lot. It's how they're raised. But this one smells so bad, Huck. Well, they all do, Jim. We can't help the way a king smells. History doesn't tell us how. Now, the Duke, he's a tolerable man in some ways. Yes, but not very different. This one's a hard lot for a Duke. When he's drunk, no nearsighted man could tell him from a king. Well, I don't hanker for no more of them, Huck. These are all I can stand. That's how I feel too, Jim. But we've got them on our hands, and we've got to remember what they are and make allowances. Sometimes I wish we could find a country without kings. What was the use of telling Jim these weren't real kings and dukes? It wouldn't have done any good. And besides, you couldn't tell them from the real kind. I went to sleep, and Jim didn't call me when it was my turn. He often did that. When I woke up just at daybreak, he was sitting with his head down, moaning and mourning to himself. I didn't take notice. I knew what it was about. He was thinking about his wife and kids, homesick. He cared just as much for his people as white folks do. It doesn't seem natural, but I reckon it's so. He often moaned and mourned that way at night, saying, "Poor little Elizabeth, poor little Johnny, it's mighty hard. I 'spect I ain't ever gonna see you no more, no more." Jim was a good man. This time we talked about his family, and by he said, "What makes me feel so bad this time is I hear something over yonder on the bank, like a whack or a slam, and it reminded me of the time I treated my little Elizabeth so ornery. She wasn't but 4 years old and had a rough spell with scarlet fever. She got well, and one day she was standing around, and I said to her, 'Shut the door.' She didn't do it, just stood there smiling at me. It made me mad, and I said again, mighty loud, 'Don't you hear me? Shut the door.' She just stood there smiling. I was boiling. I said, 'I'll make you mind,' and slapped her on the side of the head, sending her sprawling. I went into the other room for about 10 minutes, and when I came back, the door was still open and that she was standing right there looking down with tears running down. I was mad, but just then the wind slammed the door behind her and she didn't move. My breath almost jumped out of me. I crept out, trembling, and poked my head in behind her and yelled, 'Pow!' as loud as I could. She never budged. Oh, Huck, I burst out crying and grabbed her up in my arms, saying, 'Oh, the poor little thing.' The Lord God Almighty forgive poor old Jim, because he ain't ever gonna forgive himself as long as he lives. She was plumb deaf and dumb, Huck, and I'd been treating her so.
Chapter 25. The Royal Ruse and Deadly Deception.
By the time dusk rolled around, we were anchored under a tiny willow towhead smack dab in the middle of the river, caught between two sleepy villages. The Duke and the King were scheming again, plotting their next act in the never-ending traveling circus of fraud. Jim piped up, addressing the Duke. Hope y'all won't be too long. Gets mighty tiresome been tied up all day like a Christmas turkey. The Duke, never one to miss a beat, agreed. Well, it's no picnic, I grant you that. Let me see if I can't conjure up a solution. And conjure he did. In no time, Jim was decked out in a costume fit for King Lear. A ridiculous curtain calico gown, a white horsehair wig, and whiskers. Then the Duke slathered Jim's face, hands, ears, and neck with theater paint, transforming him into the bluest, most drowned-looking, sick Arab you ever laid eyes on. They even made a sign. Sick Arab, but harmless when not out of his head. Jim was surprisingly content. Better than being hogtied and shaking like a leaf every time a twig snaps, he said. The Duke advised him to hop out and howl like a wild beast if anyone got nosy. Not that they'd wait for the howling. Jim looked deader than dead. These two charlatans figured that they'd hit the non-such scam again, but decided against it. Word might have spread, and they didn't fancy a lynch mob. The Duke would hatch a new plot for the Arkansas village, while the King would let Providence guide him, meaning his gut or the devil. We had bought some fancy clothes recently, and the King got himself dolled up in black attire that transformed him from a scoundrel to a saint. He looked so righteous, you'd swear he was the prophet Leviticus himself. Jim prepped the canoe, and I readied my paddle. The King, surveying the scene, spotted a steamboat docked 3 miles up the river. Seeing as I'm dressed to the nines, let's arrive with a touch of class, Huckleberry. Fetch the steamboat, we'll ride down in style. I didn't need telling twice. Off I went, paddling up to the steamboat. Along the way, we encountered a young bumpkin on a log, sweating bullets and guarding 2 carpet bags. Hop in, said the King. Where you headed? To New Orleans, replied the bumpkin. Let my servant here help you with those bags, said the King, pointing at me. I obliged, and soon we were all aboard. The young man, grateful, struck up a conversation. He was puzzled when he first saw the King. I thought you were Mr. Wilkes, coming just in time, but you ain't him, are you? Nope, name's Blodgett, Reverend Alexander Blodgett. The King lied effortlessly. Just passing through. The bumpkin revealed his mission. He was off to Rio to see an uncle. His uncle Peter Wilkes had recently died, and the King's eyes gleamed with opportunity. The kid spilled the beans about the Wilkes family, their wealth, and the tragic timing of Peter's death. By the time we reached the steamboat, the King had milked the bumpkin dry of information. He made me paddle back to fetch the Duke, and they concocted their most audacious scam yet. The King would impersonate Harvey Wilkes, the long-lost brother, while the Duke would play the deaf and dumb William. We waited for a suitable steamboat and soon hailed one. The crew was furious when they realized we only needed a short ride, but the King's silver tongue and $1 a mile silenced their complaints. Upon reaching the village, a crowd gathered as we disembarked. The King, with a performance worthy of the stage, asked for Peter Wilkes's residence. The crowd, sensing something, exchanged knowing glances. I'm sorry to tell you, sir, one man said gently. The best we can do is tell you where he did live yesterday evening. The King put on a tearful show, collapsing into the man's arms, weeping for his poor brother. The Duke joined in, making absurd signs and blubbering. They were a pitiful sight, and the crowd, hook, line, and sinker, swallowed the act. They carried the bags, listened to the King's sob story, and filled him in on Peter's final days. The King repeated everything to the Duke in a farcical display of hand signals, both of them lamenting as if they'd lost the 12 apostles. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I'd never have believed such shameless con artistry. But there they were, fleecing the good people of Arkansas with a sob story and a pair of crocodile tears. Humanity, I thought, ain't worth much if it can be so easily fooled by the likes of them.
Chapter 26. Is It Them? The Doxologer Disaster and Funeral Fiascos.
The news hit the town faster than a gossip at a quilting bee, and within minutes, folks were sprinting from every direction, some of them still wrangling their coats on as they ran. The street turned into a parade of curious souls, tramping in unison like a marching band without instruments. Windows and yards overflowed with spectators, and every now and then, someone would shout over a fence, "Is it them?" And a reply from the crowd would echo back, "You bet it is." When we reached the house, the street was packed tighter than a can of sardines. There stood 3 girls at the door. Mary Jane, with her red hair glowing like a beacon, lit up the scene with her beauty and joy, welcoming her long-lost uncles. The king spread his arms wide, and Mary Jane flung herself into them. The harelip, not to be outdone, latched on to the duke. The scene was so touching you could practically hear the tissues being passed around. Then, with a subtle nudge, the king reminded the duke about the coffin over in the corner. The pair, with the arms draped over each other's shoulders and hands wiping away non-existent tears, shuffled slowly and solemnly towards it. The crowd fell silent. Hats came off, heads bowed, and you could have heard a pin drop. As they gazed into the coffin, they burst into tears loud enough to be heard in New Orleans. They embraced, bawling on each other's shoulders, creating a veritable flood. The emotional contagion spread, and soon everyone in the room was sobbing. The place became damper than a Louisiana swamp. One of them took one side of the coffin, the other took the other, and they knelt, resting their foreheads on it, pretending to pray. This spectacle broke the crowd down completely. The poor girls were sobbing, and nearly every woman in the room took turns kissing the girls' foreheads and offering teary-eyed blessings. It was a festival of melodrama that would have made a soap opera jealous. The king eventually stood, teary-eyed, and slobbered out a speech filled with tearful nonsense about the pain of losing their dear, diseased brother and missing seeing him alive. He droned on about the sweetened trials and holy tears, and it was all just so syrupy and insincere that it made you want to hurl. Then, just when you thought he couldn't get any more nauseating, he ended with a goody-goody amen and let loose a cry fit to burst. At that moment, someone in the crowd struck up the doxologer, and everyone joined in with gusto. It was like a wave of relief washing over the room, making you feel like you were at a church picnic instead of a weepy wake. Music does wonders for the soul, especially after such a load of emotional hogwash. The king, never missing a beat, invited a select few of the town's principal folks to supper and to sit up with the ashes of the diseased. He rattled off names like they were old friends, mentioning Reverend Hobson, Deacon Lot Hovey, Ben Rucker, Abner Shackelford, Levi Bell, Dr. Robinson, and the widow Bartley. Unfortunately, Hobson and Robinson were busy shipping a sick man to the other side of the river Styx, and Bell was off on business in Louisville. The rest were on hand, shaking the king's and duke's hands like a bunch of sycophants, while the duke, in his usual nonsensical baby talk, goo-gooed and waved. Mary Jane fetched her father's letter, which the king read aloud, milking every tear out of it. It bequeathed the house and $3,000 in gold to the girls, and the tan yard and other property worth about $7,000, plus another $3,000 in gold to the dear uncles. The letter even revealed the hiding place of $6,000 in the cellar. Off we went to retrieve it. Once we found the bag and spilled out the gold, the king's eyes lit up like he'd found the Holy Grail. "Oh, this ain't bully nor nothing. Oh, no, I reckon not. Why, Bilge, it beats the nonsuch, don't it?" he exclaimed. The duke agreed, and they pawed through the gold coins, letting them jingle through their fingers. The king declared, "It ain't no use talking, being brothers to a rich dead man, and representatives of furrin heirs that's got left is the line for you and me, Bilge. This year comes of trustin' to Providence. It's the best way in the long run. I've tried 'em all, and there ain't no better way." Most folks would have taken the pile on faith, but these two counted it. It came up $415 short. Darn him, I wonder what he'd done with that $415, fretted the king. They searched for a while before the Duke suggested they let it go, assuming the old man made a mistake. They decided to make up the deficit from their own stash to keep everything above board. Back upstairs, the king delivered another slathering of sentimental goo, handing the money to the girls in front of everyone, ensuring there'd be no suspicions. The crowd, moved to tears and applause, practically worshipped them. The king puffed up his chest, basking in their adoration. Then, a big, iron-jawed man forced his way in, listening and looking without saying a word. The king was in full swing, talking about the funeral orgies, when the Duke, unable to bear the butchering of language any longer, scribbled _obsequies _ you old fool, on a scrap of paper, and passed it to him. The king read it, pocketed it, and kept on, insisting orgies was the proper term, explaining it with a ludicrous etymology. The iron-jawed man finally had enough and laughed in the king's face. "Why, _doctor _" everyone gasped. Abner Shackelford stepped in. "Why, Robinson, haven't you heard the news? This is Harvey Wilkes." The king eagerly extended his hand. "Is it my poor brother's dear good friend and physician?" "Keep your hands off me," snapped the doctor. "You talk like an Englishman, don't you? It's the worst imitation I ever heard. You, Peter Wilkes's brother. You're a fraud." The room exploded. The girls clung to the king, sobbing. The crowd tried to calm the doctor, but he stormed on, declaring the king a liar and fraud. Mary Jane, her face a mix of defiance and sorrow, thrust the bag of money into the king's hands. "Take the $6,000 and invest it for me and my sisters any way you want. Don't give us a receipt." Everyone cheered, their trust in the frauds renewed. The doctor warned, "A time's coming when you're going to feel sick whenever you think of this day." And he stormed out. The king, mocking him, said, "We'll try and get him to send for you," earning laughs and more cheers. In the end, we had to play along with the ruse, pretending these charlatans were real royalty. What was the use of telling Jim the truth? It wouldn't have done any good. The frauds and real royalty were two sides of the same tarnished coin. And so we floated down the river, our royal pains in the neck keeping things lively. Jim often got homesick, but what could we do? We were stuck with them until Providence, or a lucky break, set us free.
Chapter 27. His Royal Shadiness and the Royal Rubes.
The next day, after the circus that was our lives had quieted down, the king, ever the charmer, asked Mary Jane about spare rooms. She said Uncle William could have the spare room. Uncle Harvey could take her room, and she'd bunk with her sisters. The attic cubbyhole would be for me, the valet. Oh, the life of luxury. Mary Jane showed us to our rooms. Hers was adorned with all sorts of girly trinkets and fripperies. The king feigned sentimentality and said it made the room feel more homely and insisted nothing be moved. The Duke's room was small but serviceable, and my cubby was, well, a cubby. That night a grand supper was held. I played the dutiful servant, waiting on the king and Duke, while the other help tended to the guests. Mary Jane presided over the table with the grace of a hostess trained by piranhas. She criticized everything, biscuits, preserves, fried chicken, baiting compliments from the guests who naturally gushed over the food. It was like a bizarre dance of social masochism. Afterwards, I dined with Joanna, the harelip, in the kitchen. She started grilling me about England, and I realized I was navigating a minefield. "Ever see the king?" she asked. "Who, William IV? Bet your buttons I have. Goes to our church." She raised an eyebrow. "Regular?" "Every Sunday, rain or shine. His pew's right opposite ours." "I thought he lived in London?" "He does, but he summers in Sheffield for the sea baths." "Sheffield isn't on the sea. I faked a choke on a chicken bone to buy time." Oh, I meant he takes sea baths in barrels. They heat the water in the palace. Oh, I see now, she said, finally satisfied. But then she got me with another zinger. Do you go to church too? Yes, regular. Where do you sit? In our pew, Uncle Harvey's pew. What does he need a pew for? Isn't he the preacher? I was floundering again. Well, you see, a church this size needs more than one preacher. Uncle Harvey's just one of 17. 17 preachers. Must take a week to get through a service. They only preach one at a time. When the rest, they loll around and pass the plate. For style, you see. She looked dubious, but let it go. Then Mary Jane and Susan walked in, and Joanna accused me of lying. Mary Jane scolded her for being unkind to a guest. I felt guilt gnaw at me. I was letting these kind souls get swindled. When they finally let me go to bed, I was resolved. I would steal back the money for them, no matter what. I'd hide it and leave a letter for Mary Jane when we got far enough away. But first, I had to find it. I crept to the Duke's room, felt around in the dark, but knew the king wouldn't trust anyone else with the cash. In the king's room, I still couldn't find anything without lighting a candle. Just then, I heard them coming. I ducked behind Mary Jane's frocks, praying I wouldn't be found. The Duke immediately checked under the bed. I was relieved I hadn't hidden there. They sat down, and the king said, "Make it quick. We should be downstairs just keeping up the morning charade." "I'm uneasy," said the Duke. "That doctor's trouble. We should skip town by 3, take what we've got and run." The king was furious. "Leave all this property? We've got thousands more to steal." The Duke grumbled but relented. Then he said, "I don't like where we hid the money. Mary Jane will be in mourning, and the servant might pack up the room and find it." The king agreed and fumbled around near where I was hiding. He pulled the bag from under the feather bed and stuffed it into the straw tick, thinking it was safer there. As soon as they left, I had the bag out. I hid it in my cubby, then considered a better spot outside. I stayed awake, waiting for silence. When the house was finally still, I slipped down the ladder. Navigating through the house like a shadow, I crept to the sitting room where the king and duke were snoring away, blissfully ignorant of their impending financial ruin. The moonlight through the window painted eerie patterns on the walls, casting everything in a ghostly glow. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart jump, but I kept moving. The money was well hidden, but I was more determined than a raccoon in a trash heap. I got to the cubby, took out the bag of gold, and sneaked it outside. The cool night air was a relief, but I had no time to savor it. I needed a foolproof hiding spot. I found an old hollow log by the riverbank. It was perfect. I stuffed the bag deep inside and covered it with leaves and twigs. Nobody would think to look there, at least not for a while. With the money secured, I felt a strange mix of triumph and dread. What if they found out? What if they suspected me? But there was no turning back now. Back in the house, I lay down fully dressed, ready to spring into action if necessary. I couldn't sleep, so I just listened to the sounds of the night, wondering what would happen next. The next morning, the house was a flurry of activity. The king and duke were up early, putting on their best morning faces. I played along all the while, feeling like a traitor in their midst. Mary Jane, ever the gracious hostess, thanked everyone for their support and prepared for the day's events. I watched as the king and duke interacted with the townspeople, spinning their lies with the ease of seasoned con artists. It was disgusting yet fascinating. These people, so kind and trusting, had no idea they were being played for fools. By midday, the town was abuzz with preparations for Peter Wilkes's funeral. The king and duke were milking it for all it was worth, but I had done my part. The money was safe, and soon enough, they'd be out of here. As the day wore on, I saw my chance to slip away. I made my way to the river where Jim was waiting with the raft. He looked at me, puzzled. "What's going on, Huck?" "I did it, Jim. I took the money. It's hidden where they won't find it." Jim's eyes widened. "We best be moving then, before they notice." We pushed off, the familiar comfort of the raft beneath us. As we drifted down the river, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The king and duke might be swindlers, but they wouldn't get away with everything. The Wilkes sisters would be all right. As the raft floated into the night, I looked back at the town, a tiny dot on the horizon. I thought of Mary Jane, Susan, and Joanna, three kind-hearted girls who deserved better. They'd find the money eventually, and when they did, they'd know someone was looking out for them. Jim and I were on our way again, free and easy. The river was our home, and though it was full of dangers and uncertainties, it was better than any place I'd ever known. We had each other, and that was enough. As the stars twinkled overhead, I felt a strange sense of peace. The world was full of frauds and cheats, but there were also good people like the Wilkes sisters, and even folks like Jim and me, who just wanted to find our place in it. The adventure wasn't over, but for now, it felt like we were on the right path.
Chapter 28. The Funeral, When Curiosity Killed the Scam, Huck's Tightrope Act.
I crept to their doors and listened. They were snoring like they were in a competition to wake the dead. So I tiptoed along and got downstairs without making a sound. It was as quiet as a graveyard at midnight. I peeped through a crack in the dining room door and saw the men who were supposed to be watching the corpse all sound asleep in their chairs. The door was open into the parlor where the corpse lay, and there was a candle in both rooms. I passed along and saw the parlor door was open, but there wasn't anyone in there but the remains of Peter. So I shoved on by, but the front door was locked and the key wasn't there. Just then, I heard someone coming down the stairs behind me. I ran into the parlor and took a swift look around, and the only place to hide the bag was in the coffin. The lid was shoved along about a foot, showing the dead man's face with a wet cloth over it and his shroud on. I tucked the money bag in under the lid, just down beyond where his hands were crossed, which made me creep. They were so cold. Then I ran back across the room and hid behind the door. The person coming was Mary Jane. She went to the coffin very softly and kneeled down and looked in. Then she put up her handkerchief, and I saw she began to cry, though I couldn't hear her and her back was to me. I slid out, and as I passed the dining room, I thought I'd make sure those watchers hadn't seen me. So I looked through the crack, and everything was all right. They hadn't stirred. I slipped up to bed, feeling rather blue about the whole thing. After all that trouble and risk, the money was still in the coffin, and the king would get it again when they screwed on the lid. I wanted to slide down and get it out of there, but I didn't dare try. Every minute it was getting earlier, and pretty soon some of those watchers would begin to stir, and I might get caught with $6,000 in my hands that nobody had hired me to take care of. I didn't wish to be mixed up in any such business as that. When I got downstairs in the morning, the parlor was shut up, and the watchers were gone. There wasn't anyone around but the family, the widow Bartley, and our tribe. I watched their faces to see if anything had happened, but I couldn't tell. Towards the middle of the day, the undertaker came with his man, and they set the coffin in the middle of the room on a couple of chairs, and then set all our chairs in rows, borrowing more from the neighbors until the hall, parlor, and dining room were full. I saw the coffin lid was the way it was before, but I didn't dare go look under it with folks around. Then the people began to flock in, and the girls and the king and duke took seats in the front row at the head of the coffin. For half an hour, the people filed around slowly in single rank and looked down at the dead man's face for a minute. Some dropped a tear, and it was all very still and solemn, except for the girls and the king and duke holding handkerchiefs to their eyes and sobbing a little. The only other sound was the scraping of feet on the floor and the blowing of noses, because people always blow their noses more at funerals than at other places except church. When the place was packed full, the undertaker slid around in his black gloves with his soft, soothing ways, putting on the last touches and getting people and things all shipshape and comfortable, making no more sound than a cat. He never spoke. He moved people around, squeezed in latecomers, opened up passageways, and did it all with nods and hand signals. Then he took his place against the wall. He was the softest, glidingest, stealthiest man I ever saw. And there wasn't any more smile to him than there is to a ham. They had borrowed a melodeum, a sick one, and when everything was ready, a young woman sat down and worked it. It was pretty squeaky and colicky, but everybody joined in and sang. Peter was the only one that had a good thing, according to my notion. Then The Reverend Hobson opened up slow and solemn and began to talk. Straight off, the most outrageous row busted out in the cellar a body ever heard. It was only one dog, but he made a most powerful racket, and he kept it up right along. The parson had to stand there over the coffin and wait. You couldn't hear yourself think. It was awkward, and nobody seemed to know what to do. But pretty soon they saw the long-legged undertaker make a sign to the preacher, as much as to say, "Don't you worry, just depend on me." Then he stooped down and began to glide along the wall, just his shoulders showing over the people's heads. So he glided along, and the powwow and racket getting more and more outrageous all the time. And at last, when he had gone around 2 sides of the room, he disappeared down cellar. Then, in about 2 seconds, we heard a whack, and the dog finished up with the most amazing howl or two. And then everything was dead still, and the parson began his solemn talk where he left off. In a minute or two, here comes this undertaker's back and shoulders gliding along the wall again. And so he glided and glided around 3 sides of the room, and then rose up, shaded his mouth with his hands, stretched his neck out toward the preacher, over the people's heads, and said in a kind of coarse whisper, he had a rat. Then he drooped down and glided along the wall again to his place. You could see it was a great satisfaction to the people because naturally they wanted to know. A little thing like that doesn't cost anything. And it's just the little things that make a man be looked up to and liked. There wasn't any more popular man in town than that undertaker. Well, the funeral sermon was very good, but poisonously long and tiresome. And then the king shoved in and got off some of his usual rubbish. And at last the job was through. And the undertaker began to sneak up on the coffin with his screwdriver. I was in a sweat then and watched him pretty keen. But he never meddled at all. Just slid the lid along as soft as mush and screwed it down tight and fast. So there I was. I didn't know whether the money was in there or not. So I said to myself, suppose somebody has hogged that bag on the sly. Now, how do I underscore know whether to write to Mary Jane or not? Suppose she dug him up and didn't find anything. What would she think of me? Blame it, I said. I might get hunted up and jailed. I'd better lay low and keep dark and not write at all. The thing's awful mixed now. Trying to better it, I've worsened it 100 times. And I wish to goodness I'd just let it alone. Dad fetched the whole business. They buried him and we came back home. And I went to watching faces again. I couldn't help it. And I couldn't rest easy, but nothing came of it. The faces didn't tell me anything. The king visited around in the evening, sweetening everybody up, making himself ever so friendly. And he gave out the idea that his congregation over in England would be in a sweat about him. So he must hurry and settle up the estate right away and leave for home. He was very sorry he was so pushed, and so was everybody. They wished he could stay longer, but they said they could see it couldn't be done. And he said, of course, he and William would take the girls home with them. And that pleased everybody, too, because then the girls would be well fixed and amongst their own relations. It pleased the girls, too. Tickled them. So they clean forgot they ever had a trouble in the world and told him to sell out as quick as he wanted to. They would be ready. Them poor things were that glad and happy. It made my heart ache to see them getting fooled and lied to so. But I didn't see any safe way for me to chip in and change the general tune. Well, blamed if the king didn't build a house and all the property for auction straight off. Sailed 2 days after the funeral. But anybody could buy private beforehand if they wanted to. So, the next day after the funeral, along about noontime, the girls' joy got the first jolt. A couple of slave traders came along, and the king sold them the slaves cheap for 3-day drafts, as they called it. Away they went, the 2 sons up the river to Memphis, and their mother down the river to Orleans. I thought them poor girls and them poor dudes would break their hearts for grief. They cried round each other and took on so. It most made me down sick to see it. The girls said they hadn't ever dreamed of seeing the families separated or sold away from the town. I can't ever get it out of my memory, the sight of them poor miserable girls and guys hanging around each other's necks and crying. And I reckon I couldn't have stood it all, but would have had to bust out and tell on our gang if I hadn't known the sale wasn't any account, and the blacks would be back home in a week or 2. The thing made a big stir in the town, too, and a good many came out flat-footed and said it was scandalous to separate the mother and the children that way. It injured the fraud some, but the old fool he bulled right along, spite of all the Duke could say or do, and I tell you the Duke was powerful uneasy. Next day was auction day. About broad day in the morning, the king and the Duke came up in the garret and woke me up, and I saw by their look that there was trouble. The king says, "Was you in my room night before last?" "No, your majesty," which was the way I always called him when nobody but our gang wasn't around. "Was you in there yesterday or last night?" "No, your majesty." "Honor bright now, no lies." "Honor bright, your majesty, I'm telling you the truth. I haven't been near your room since Miss Mary Jane took you and the Duke and showed it to you." The Duke says, "Have you seen anybody else go in there?" "No, your grace, not as I remember, I believe." "Stop and think." I studied a while and saw my chance. Then I says, "Well, I saw the black dudes go in there several times." Both of them gave a little jump, looking like they hadn't expected it, and then like they had. Then the Duke says, "What, all of them?" "No, leastways, not all at once. That is, I don't think I ever saw them all come out at once, but just one time." "Hello, when was that?" "It was the day we had the funeral, in the morning. It wasn't early because I overslept. I was just starting down the ladder and I saw them." "Well, go on, go on. What did they do? How did they act?" "They didn't do anything, and they didn't act much, as far as I saw. They tiptoed away, so I saw, easy enough, that they'd shoved in there to do up your majesty's room or something, supposing you were up, and found you weren't up. And so they were hoping to slide out of the way of trouble without waking you up if they hadn't already woken you up." "Great guns, this is a go," says the king. And both of them looked pretty sick and tolerable silly. They stood there a-thinking and scratching their heads a minute, and the Duke he burst into a kind of little raspy chuckle and says, "It does beat all how neat those dudes played their hand. They let on to be sorry they were going out of this region. And I believe they were sorry, and so did you, and so did everybody. Don't ever tell me anymore that a black ain't got any histrionic talent. Why, the way they played that thing, it would fool anybody. In my opinion, there's a fortune in them. If I had capital and a theater, I wouldn't want a better layout than that. And here we've gone and sold them for a song. Yes, and ain't privileged to sing the song yet. Say, where's that song, that draft?" "In the bank to be collected." "Where would it be?" "Well, that's all right then, thank goodness," says I, kind of timid-like. "Is something gone wrong?" The king whirls on me and rips out, "None of your business. You keep your head shut and mind your own affairs, if you got any. Long as you're in this town, don't you forget that, you hear?" Then he says to the Duke, "We got to just swallow it and say nothing. Mum's the word for us." As they were starting down the ladder, the Duke chuckles again and says, "Quick sales and small profits. It's a good business, yes." The king snarls round on him and says, "I was trying to do for the best in selling them out so quick. If the profits have turned out to be none, lacking considerable, and none to carry, is it my fault any more than it's yours?" Well, they'd be in this house yet, and we wouldn't if I could have gotten my advice listened to. The king sassed back as much as was safe for him, and then swapped around and lit into me again. He gave me down the banks for not coming, telling him I saw the black dudes come out of his room acting that way, said any fool would have known something was up, and then waltzed in and cussed himself a while, and said it all came of him not laying late and taking his natural rest that morning, and he'd be blamed if he'd ever do it again. So they went off a-jawing, and I felt dreadful glad I'd worked it all off onto the dudes, and yet hadn't done them any harm by it.
Chapter 29. The Voyage to Vexation and the Royal Rumble. The Journey to Jolly Old England. Or so they thought.
By the time the sun decided it was morning, I slid down the ladder and made my way downstairs. As I passed the girls' room, I saw Mary Jane sitting beside her old hair trunk, packing for her grand adventure to England. But instead of looking excited, she was crying into a folded gown, tears falling like she'd just heard the world's saddest joke. Anyone with a heart would feel bad seeing her like that. I went in and said, "Miss Mary Jane, You don't like to see folks in trouble, and neither do I. What's wrong? And she spilled the beans. It was about the slaves, naturally. She said the trip to England was spoiled for her because the slave family was being torn apart. She sobbed, "Oh, dear, dear, to think they ain't ever going to see each other anymore." I blurted out, "But they will inside of 2 weeks. And I know it." Faster than I could regret it, she had her arms around my neck, begging me to say it again. I knew I'd overstepped, so I asked her to give me a minute to think. She looked at me, hopeful and relieved, like someone who's just had a tooth pulled out and realized they can still eat pie. I pondered if the truth might actually be safer than a lie for once. It felt like sitting on a keg of gunpowder, just to see what would happen. But I decided to go for it. "Miss Mary Jane, is there a place out of town where you could stay for 3 or 4 days?" "Yes, Mr. Lothrop's. Why?" "Never mind why yet. If I tell you how I know the slaves will see each other again inside of 2 weeks, will you go to Mr. Lothrop's and stay for 4 days?" "4 days," she said. "I'll stay a year." "All right," I said. "I don't need anything more than your word. I'd rather have it than another man's oath on a Bible." She smiled, and I felt a little better. "If you don't mind, I'll shut the door and bolt it." Then I sat back down. "Don't scream, just take it like a man. I've got to tell the truth, and you need to brace yourself because it's going to be rough. Those uncles of yours aren't your uncles. They're frauds, regular deadbeats. There, now that's over. You can handle the rest." Her eyes blazed, but she let me continue. I told her everything from meeting the young fool to the king's charade of kissing her at the door. She jumped up furious. "The brute! Let's tar and feather them and throw them in the river." "Sure," I said. "But do you mean before you go to Mr. Lothrop's or—" She sat down again, realizing her mistake. "Oh, what am I thinking? Please don't. Just tell me what to do and I'll do it." I explained my plan. She had to lay low at Mr. Lothrop's until 9 or half past tonight. If she got back before 11, she should put a candle in the window. If I didn't turn up, it meant I was gone and safe, and she could spread the news and get those frauds jailed. "Good," she said. "I'll do it. And if I get caught, you must say I told you everything beforehand and stand by me." "I will," she said fiercely. "They won't touch a hair on your head." I told her how to prove the frauds weren't her uncles. Write down Royal Nonsuch, Bricksville. When the court needs to know about these two, send for witnesses from Bricksville. You'll have the whole town here in no time. I felt good about the plan. Just let the auction go on and don't worry. Nobody has to pay until a day after, and the sale won't count. They're in a fix, Miss Mary. "I'll go to Mr. Lothrop's now," she said. "No, go before breakfast," I insisted. "Why?" "Because you aren't a good liar. Your face will give you away." She agreed and got ready to leave. I told her about the bag of money, that I'd hidden it but didn't want to say where just yet. I wrote it down for her. I put it in the coffin. Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook my hand hard, saying she'd never forget me and would pray for me. Mary Jane left without anyone seeing her. I told her sisters that she'd gone to visit the Proctors because one of them was sick. When they asked who, I said, "Hanner." "My goodness, she was well last week. Is she bad?" "It's the mumps." "Mumps? They don't sit up with people for the mumps." "These mumps are different, mixed with measles, whooping cough, and everything else." "My land! And they call it the mumps?" "Yep, starts with the mumps." "Well, is it catching?" "Like a harrow in the dark. If you catch one tooth, you catch the whole thing." "I'll go tell Uncle Harvey," the hare-lip said. "Sure," I said, "but he won't leave you here alone." "Well, maybe you're right. But you should tell him she's gone out for a bit." "Yes, Miss Mary Jane wanted you to tell them she's gone to ask the Apthorps to come to the auction." They agreed and went to give the message. Everything was set. The auction went on, with the king quoting scripture and the duke playing for sympathy. It dragged on until everything was sold except a graveyard lot. Just then, a steamboat landed, and a crowd came up yelling, "Here's your opposition line. 2 sets of heirs to Peter Wilkes. Pay your money and take your choice."
Chapter 30. The family reunion, extravaganza, lost loot and literary hilarity, Huck's great escape.
They were bringing along a very distinguished-looking old gentleman, and a younger one with his right arm in a sling. And my souls, how the townsfolk hooted and hollered. They were having the time of their lives, but I couldn't see what was so funny about it. I figured the Duke and the King would be sweating bullets. But no, they didn't even bat an eye. The Duke was just goo-gooing around, happy as a clam, like a jug gurgling out buttermilk. And the King, well, he just stared sorrowfully at the newcomers, as if it gave him heartburn to think there could be such frauds and rascals in the world. Oh, he played his part beautifully. Lots of the principal folks gathered around the King, showing their allegiance. The old gentleman who had just arrived looked all confused. Pretty soon he began to speak, and I saw straight off he pronounced like an Englishman. Not the King's way, though the King's imitation wasn't half bad. I can't mimic the old gent's words, but he turned to the crowd and said something like this. This is quite a surprise, I must say. I wasn't expecting it, and I'm not well prepared to deal with it. My brother and I have had some misfortunes. He's broken his arm, and our baggage was mistakenly put off at a town above here last night. I am Peter Wilkes's brother, Harvey, and this is his brother, William, who can't hear or speak, and can't even make signs effectively, now that he's only got one hand to work with. We are who we say we are, and in a day or two, when I get the baggage, I can prove it. Until then, I'll say no more, but go to the hotel and wait. So he and the new dummy started off, and the King laughed and blethered out, broke his arm. Very likely, isn't it? And very convenient, too, for a fraud that's got to make signs and hasn't learned how. Lost their baggage. That's mighty good and mighty ingenious under the circumstances. So he laughed again, and so did everybody else, except 3 or 4, or maybe half a dozen. One of these was that doctor. Another one was a sharp-looking gentleman with an old-fashioned carpet bag made of carpet stuff, who had just come off the steamboat and was talking to the doctor in a low voice, glancing towards the King now and then and nodding their heads. It was Levi Bell, the lawyer who had gone up to Louisville. Another one was a big, rough husky who came along and listened to all the old gentleman said, and was listening to the King now. And when the King got done, this husky up and says, "Say, looky here, if you are Harvey Wilkes, when did you come to this town?" "The day before the funeral, friend," says the King. "But what time of day?" "In the evening, about an hour or 2 before sundown." "How'd you come?" "I come down on the Susan Powell from Cincinnati." "Well then, how'd you come to be up at the Pint in the morning?" "In a canoe." "I warn't up at the Pint in the morning." "It's a lie." Several of them jumped for him and begged him not to talk that way to an old man and a preacher. "Preacher be hanged. He's a fraud and a liar. He was up at the Pint that morning. I live up there, don't I? Well, I was up there, and he was up there. I see him there. He came in a canoe along with Tim Collins and a boy." The doctor he up and says, "Would you know the boy again if you was to see him, Hines?" "I reckon I would, but I don't know. Why, yonder he is now. I know him perfectly easy." It was me he pointed at. The doctor says, "Neighbors, I don't know whether the new couple are frauds or not, but if these two ain't frauds, I am an idiot, that's all. I think it's our duty to see that they don't get away from here till we've looked into this thing. Come along, Hines, come along the rest of you. We'll take these fellows to the tavern and confront them with t'other couple. And I reckon we'll find out something before we get through." It was nuts for the crowd, though maybe not for the King's friends. So we all started. It was about sundown. The doctor led me along by the hand, being plenty kind enough, but never letting go my hand. We all got into a big room in the hotel, lit up some candles, and fetched in the new couple. First, the doctor says, "I don't wish to be too hard on these two men, but I think they're frauds, and they may have accomplices we don't know about. If they have, won't the accomplices get away with that bag of gold Peter Wilkes left? It's not unlikely. If these men aren't frauds, they won't object to sending for that money and letting us keep it till they prove they're all right. Isn't that so?" Everybody agreed to that. So I figured they had our gang in a pretty tight spot right from the get-go. But the king just looked sorrowful and said, "Gentlemen, I wish the money was there, for I have no desire to hinder a fair, open, out-and-out investigation of this miserable business. But alas, the money isn't there. You can send and see if you want to." "Where is it then?" "Well, when my niece gave it to me to keep for her, I took and hid it inside the straw tick of my bed, not wanting to bank it for the few days we'd be here, and considering the bed a safe place, we not being used to black people and supposing them honest, like servants in England. Those dudes stole it the very next morning after I'd gone downstairs, and when I sold them, I hadn't missed the money yet, so they got clean away with it. My servant here can tell you about it, gentlemen." The doctor and several others said, "Shucks," and I saw nobody believed him entirely. One man asked me if I saw the dudes steal it. I said no, but I saw them sneaking out of the room and hustling away, and I never thought anything, only I reckoned they were afraid they had woken my master and were trying to get away before he made trouble with them. That was all they asked me. Then the doctor whirls on me and says, "Are you English too?" I says yes, and him and some others laughed and said, "Stuff." Well, then they started on the general investigation, and there we had it, up and down, hour in, hour out, and nobody ever said a word about supper, nor seemed to think about it. And so they kept it up and kept it up, and it was the most mixed up thing you ever saw. They made the king tell his story, and they made the old gentleman tell his. And anybody but a bunch of prejudiced chuckleheads would have seen that the old gentleman was spinning truth and the other one was spinning lies. By and by, they had me up to tell what I knew. The king gave me a left-handed look out of the corner of his eye, so I knew enough to talk on the right side. I began to tell about Sheffield and how we lived there, and all about the English Wilkses and so on. But I didn't get very far before the doctor began to laugh. And Levi Bell, the lawyer, says, "Sit down, my boy. I wouldn't strain myself if I were you. I reckon you ain't used to lying. It doesn't seem to come handy. What you need is practice. You do it pretty awkwardly." I didn't care for the compliment, but I was glad to be let off anyway. The doctor, he started to say something and turns and says, "If you'd been in town at first, Levi Bell." The king broke in and reached out his hand and says, "Why, is this my poor dead brother's old friend he's written so often about?" The lawyer and him shook hands, and the lawyer smiled and looked pleased, and they talked right along for a while, and then got to one side and talked low. And at last, the lawyer speaks up and says, "That'll fix it. I'll take the order and send it, along with your brothers, and then they'll know it's all right." So they got some paper and a pen, and the king sat down, twisted his head to one side, and chawed his tongue, and scrawled off something. Then they gave the pen to the duke, and for the first time the duke looked sick, but he took the pen and wrote. So then the lawyer turns to the new old gentleman and says, "Right, you and your brother please write a line or two and sign your names." The old gentleman wrote, but nobody could read it. The lawyer looked powerful astonished and says, "Well, it beats me," and pulled out a lot of old letters from his pocket, examined them, and then examined the old man's writing, and then those letters again, and then says, "These old letters are from Harvey Wilkes, and here are these two handwritings, and anybody can see they didn't write them." The king and the duke looked sold and foolish, I tell you, to see how the lawyer had taken them in. And here's this old gentleman's handwriting, and anybody can tell, easy enough, he didn't write them. Fact is, the scratches he makes ain't properly writing at all. Now here's some letters from the new old gentleman says, "If you please, let me explain. Nobody can read my hand but my brother there, so he copies for me. It's his hand you've got there, not mine." "Well," says the lawyer, "this is a state of things. I've got some of William's letters too, so if you'll get him to write a line or so, we can come." "He can't write with his left hand," says the old gentleman. "If he could use his right hand, you would see that he wrote his own letters, and mine too. Look at both, please. They're by the same hand." The lawyer did and says, "I believe it's so. And if it ain't so, there's a heap stronger resemblance than I'd noticed before anyway." Well, well, well. I thought we were right on the track of a solution, but it's gone to grass partly. But anyway, one underscore thing is proved. These two ain't either of them Wilkses. And he wagged his head toward the king and the duke. Well, what do you think? That mule-headed old fool wouldn't give in then. Indeed, he wouldn't. Said it wasn't a fair test. Said his brother William was the cussedest joker in the world, and hadn't tried to write. He saw William was going to play one of his jokes the minute he put the pen to paper. And so he warmed up and went warbling and warbling right along till he was actually beginning to believe what he was saying himself. But pretty soon the new gentleman broke in and says, "I've thought of something. Is there anybody here who helped to lay out the late Peter Wilkes for burying?" "Yes," says somebody. "Me and Ab Turner done it. We're both here." Then the old man turns toward the king and says, "Perhaps this gentleman can tell me what was tattooed on his breast." Blamed if the king didn't have to brace up mighty quick, or he'd have squashed down like a bluff bank that the river has cut under. It took him so sudden. And mind you, it was a thing that was calculated to make most anybody squash to get fetched such a solid one as that without any notice. Because how was he going to know what was tattooed on the man? He whitened a little. He couldn't help it. And it was mighty still in there, and everybody bending a little forwards and gazing at him. Says I to myself, now he'll throw up the sponge. There ain't no more use. Well, did he? A body can't hardly believe it, but he didn't. I reckon he thought he'd keep the thing up till he'd tired them people out, so they'd thin out, and he and the Duke could break loose and he'd get away. Anyway, he sat there, and pretty soon he began to smile and says, "Oof. It's a very tough question, ain't it?" "Yes, sir, I can tell you what's tattooed on his breast. It's just a small, thin, blue arrow. That's what it is. And if you don't look close, you can't see it. Now, what do you say, hey?" Well, I never saw anything like that old blister for clean out and out cheek. The new old gentleman turns brisk towards Ab Turner and his pard, and his eye lights up like he judged he'd got the king underscore this underscore time, and says, "There, you've heard what he said. Was there any such mark on Peter Wilkes's breast?" Both of them spoke up and says, "We didn't see no such mark." "Good," says the old gentleman. "Now what you did see on his breast was a small dim P and a B, which is an initial he dropped when he was young, and a W with dashes between them, so PBW. And he marked them that way on a piece of paper. Come, ain't that what you saw?" Both of them spoke up again and says, "No, we didn't. We never saw any marks at all." Well, everybody was in a state of mind now, and they sings out, "The whole bilin' of 'em's frauds. Let's duck 'em. Let's drown 'em. Let's ride 'em on a rail." And everybody was whooping at once, and there was a rattling powwow. But the lawyer jumps on the table and yells and says, "Gentlemen, gentlemen, hear me just a word, just a single word, if you please. There's one way yet. Let's go and dig up the corpse and look." That took them. "Hooray!" they all shouted and were starting right off. But the lawyer and the doctor sung out, hold on, hold on. Collar all these 4 men and the boy, and fetch them along too." "We'll do it," they all shouted. "And if we don't find the marks, we'll lynch the whole gang." I was scared now, I tell you. But there wasn't any getting away, you know. They gripped us all and marched us right along, straight for the graveyard, which was a 1.5 miles down the river, and the whole town at our heels, for we made noise enough, and it was only 9 in the evening. As we went by our house, I wished I hadn't sent Mary Jane out of town, because now if I could tip her the wink, she'd light out and save me, and blow on our deadbeats. Well, we swarmed along down the river road, just carrying on like wildcats. And to make it more scary, the sky was darkening up, and the lightning beginning to wink and flitter, and the wind to shiver amongst the leaves. This was the most awful trouble and most dangerous I ever was in. And I was kind of stunned. Everything was going so differently from what I had allowed for. Instead of being fixed so I could take my own time if I wanted to, and see all the fun, and have Mary Jane at my back to save me and set me free when the close fit came, here was nothing in the world between me and sudden death but just them tattoo marks. If they didn't find them, I couldn't bear to think about it, and yet somehow I couldn't think about anything else. It got darker and darker, and it was a beautiful time to give the crowd the slip. But that big husky had me by the wrist, Hines, and a body might as well try to give Goliath the slip. He dragged me right along, he was so excited, and I had to run to keep up. When they got there, they swarmed into the graveyard and washed over it like an overflow. And when they got to the grave, they found they had about 100 times as many shovels as they wanted. But nobody had thought to fetch a lantern. But they sailed into digging anyway, by the flicker of the lightning, and sent a man to the nearest house, a half a mile off, to borrow one. So they dug and dug like everything. And it got awful dark, and the rain started, and the wind swished and swooshed along, and the lightning came brisker and brisker, and the thunder boomed. But those people never took any notice of it. They were so full of this business. In 1 minute, you could see everything and every face in that big crowd, and the shovelfuls of dirt sailing up out of the grave. In the next second, the dark wiped it all out, and you couldn't see anything at all. At last, they got out the coffin and began to unscrew the lid. And then such another crowding and shouldering and shoving as there was, to scrooge in and get a sight you never saw. And in the dark that way, it was awful. Heinz hurt my wrist dreadful, pulling and tugging so, and I reckon he clean forgot I was in the world. He was so excited and panting. All of a sudden, the lightning let go a perfect sluice of white glare, and somebody sings out, "By the living Jingo, here's the bag of gold on his breast." Heinz let out a whoop like everybody else, and dropped my wrist and gave a big surge to bust his way in and get a look. And the way I lit out and shinned for the road in the dark, there ain't nobody can tell. I had the road all to myself, and I fairly flew. Leastways, I had it all to myself, except the solid dark and the now and then glares and the buzzing of the rain and the thrashing of the wind and the splitting of the thunder. And sure as you're born, I did clip it along. When I struck the town, I saw there wasn't anybody out in the storm, so I never hunted for no back streets, but humped it straight through the main one. And when I began to get towards our house, I aimed my eye and set it. No light there. The house all dark, which made me feel sorry and disappointed. I didn't know why. But at last, just as I was sailing by, flash comes the light in Mary Jane's window. And my heart swelled up sudden, like to bust. And the same second, the house and all was behind me in the dark and wasn't ever going to be before me no more in this world. She was the best girl I ever saw and had the most sand. The minute I was far enough above the town to see I could make the towhead, I began to look sharp for a boat to borrow. And the first time the lightning showed me one that wasn't chained, I snatched it and shoved. It was a canoe and wasn't fastened with anything but a rope. The towhead was a rattling big distance off, away out there in the middle of the river, but I didn't lose any time. And when I struck the raft at last, I was so fagged, I would have just laid down to blow and gasp if I could afford it. But I didn't. As I sprung aboard, I sung out, "Out with you, Jim, and set her loose. Glory be to goodness, we're shut of them." Jim lit out and was coming for me with both arms spread. He was so full of joy, but when I glimpsed him in the lightning, my heart shot up in my mouth and I went overboard backwards. For I forgot he was old King Lear and a drowned Arab all in one. And it almost scared the livers and lights out of me. But Jim fished me out and was going to hug me and bless me, and so on. He was so glad I was back, and we were shut of the king and the duke. But I says, "Not now. Have it for breakfast, have it for breakfast. Cut loose and let her slide." So in 2 seconds away, we went a-sliding down the river. And it did seem so good to be free again and all by ourselves on the big river and nobody to bother us. I had to skip around a bit and jump up and crack my heels a few times. I couldn't help it. But about the third crack, I noticed a sound that I knew mighty well, and held my breath and listened and waited. And sure enough, when the next flash busted out over the water, here they come, and just a-laying to their oars and making their skiff hum. It was the king and the duke. So I wilted right down onto the planks then and gave up. And it was all I could do to keep from crying.
Chapter 31. The Royal Rumble.
When they finally got aboard, the king went for me, grabbing me by the collar and shaking me like I was a rag doll. Say, trying to give us the slip, were you little scoundrel? Tired of our company, huh? No, your majesty, please don't. We weren't honest. Spill it then. Tell us what your grand plan was or I'll shake the stuffing out of you. Honest, I'll tell you everything. The man who had me was real kind, kept saying I reminded him of his dead son. When they found the gold, everyone went nuts, rushing for the coffin. He let go of me and whispered, "Run now, or they'll hang you. So I took off. I couldn't do anything to help, and I didn't want to get hanged. So I ran to the canoe and told Jim to hurry before they caught us. I was scared you and the Duke were goners. Ask Jim if you don't believe me. Jim vouched for me, but the king wasn't buying it. He shook me again and threatened to drown me, but the Duke stepped in. "Let go the boy, you old fool. What would you have done? Did you look for him when you got loose? I don't recall you doing any searching." The king let go, cussing everyone in that town up and down. But the Duke shot back, "You should cuss yourself more. You've been the brainless leader of this farce from the start. Except for that blue arrow marked trick. That was genius. If it hadn't been for that, we'd be in jail waiting for those Englishmen's baggage. And if the fools hadn't rushed to see the gold, we'd be wearing nooses by now." They went quiet for a minute, thinking it over. Then the king muttered, "And we thought the black dudes stole it." That made me squirm. "Yes," the Duke said slowly, "we did." After a pause, the king added, "At least I did." The Duke shot back, "On the contrary, I did." The king bristled. "What are you implying, Bilgewater?" The Duke fired back, "What are you implying?" "Shucks," said the king sarcastically. "Maybe you were asleep and didn't know what you were doing." The Duke bristled. "Oh, shut up. Do you think I'm a fool? Don't you think I know who hid that money?" "Yes, sir. I know you do because you did it yourself." "It's a lie," and the Duke lunged at him. The king yelped, "Get your hands off my throat. I take it back." The Duke growled, "First admit you hid the money intending to double-cross me." "Wait a minute, Duke. Answer me this. If you didn't hide the money, say it, and I'll believe you." "You scoundrel, I didn't. There now." "Fine, but answer this one. Don't get mad. Did you plan to steal the money?" The Duke stayed silent for a bit, then said, "I don't care if I did. I didn't do it. But you not only planned it, you did it." "I swear I didn't do it, Duke. I thought about it, but someone beat me to it." "Liar. You did it, and you have to admit it or—" The king began to choke, then gasped, "Enough! I own up!" I felt a wave of relief. The Duke let go and said, "If you ever deny it again, I'll drown you. You should be ashamed, gobbling everything up like an ostrich while I trusted you." "It's ridiculous to think I believed your lies. You wanted to cover the deficit to steal my share, didn't you?" The king, still sniffling, said timidly, "Duke, it was you who said make up the deficit, not me." "Shut up. I don't want to hear another word from you. Now look what you've done. They've got their money back and most of ours. Get to bed and don't talk to me about deficits again." The king slinked into the wigwam, reaching for his bottle for comfort. The Duke soon followed suit. Within half an hour, they were as thick as thieves again, drunk and snoring in each other's arms. Despite their mellow state, I noticed the king didn't forget not to deny hiding the money again. That made me feel more at ease. When they finally started snoring, Jim and I had a long talk, and I told him everything that had happened. "Well, Jim," I said, "I reckon we're in a mighty tight spot. Those two frauds won't stop until they've bled this town dry. We need to get out of here." Jim nodded, his eyes wide with worry. "Huck, I've been thinking. What if we just leave now? Get on that raft and push off. They won't be able to find us." "That's the plan, Jim. But we got to be careful. Those two will be on us like a hound on a bone if they get a whiff of us leaving. We need to wait till they're dead asleep." We waited, listening to the drunken snores of the king and the Duke. The river lapped softly against the raft, a reminder of the freedom that lay just a push away. I felt a knot of anticipation in my stomach. It was now or never. "Jim," I whispered, "get the raft ready. We're leaving as soon as they start snoring louder." Jim slipped off quietly, moving like a shadow. I stayed behind, keeping an eye on the two drunks. They were tangled up like old lovers, bottles clutched in their hands, mumbling incoherently in their sleep. I crept over to where they lay, making sure they were truly out. The king mumbled something about gold and the black dudes, and I felt a surge of anger. These men had caused so much trouble, and for what? Greed, plain and simple. When I was sure they were out cold, I gave Jim the signal. We pushed off silently, the raft gliding away from the shore like a ghost in the night. The current took us, and soon we were drifting down the river, the town and its troubles slipping away behind us. As we floated down the Mississippi, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. We were free again, at least for the moment. Jim and I sat in silence, watching the stars overhead. The river was our road, and as long as we stayed on it, we had a chance. Jim, I said finally, breaking the silence, we're gonna make it. We're gonna get you to freedom. Jim looked at me, his eyes full of gratitude. Thank you, Huck. You's a good friend. We gonna make it. I knows it. We floated on, the night wrapping us in its cool embrace. The king and the duke were behind us, and the open river lay ahead. For the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we'd find our way to freedom after all.
Chapter 32. The Grand Plan of the Desperate Charlatans.
Days drifted by in a blurry haze of river water and paranoia, as we dared not stop at any town. We kept floating southward, deeper into the warm, oppressive air. We were a long way from home now, surrounded by Spanish moss hanging from trees like nature's idea of a bad toupee. The frauds, our beloved king and duke, started to feel safe enough to work their so-called magic in the villages again. Their first act? A lecture on temperance. Ironically, they made just enough to keep themselves sober. Next, they launched a dancing school, despite having less rhythm than a drunken kangaroo. The public promptly showed them the exit. Then they tried their hand at elocution, but their audience gave them an earful of invective instead. They cycled through missionary work, mesmerism, fortune-telling, and even snake oil sales. But their luck was as rotten as their souls. Dead broke and desperate, they spent their days lounging on the raft, whispering in their wigwam like conspiratorial clowns. Jim and I didn't like it one bit. We figured they were planning something even more devious than their usual shenanigans. We swore to ditch them at the first chance. One morning, we hid the raft 2 miles below a decrepit village named Pikesville. The king went ashore, telling us to stay put while he sniffed around to see if anyone had heard of the Royal Nonesuch. House to rob, I thought, and when you get back, you'll wonder where Jim and I went. If he didn't return by midday, the Duke and I would know it was safe to follow. The Duke spent the morning in a foul mood, blaming us for everything and barking orders like a madman. Something was definitely brewing. By noon, the king hadn't returned, so the Duke and I headed to the village. We found the king in a dive bar, sloshed and surrounded by jeering loafers. The Duke lit into him, and they started a loud, drunken argument. I saw my chance and bolted like a rabbit on fire. "Set her loose, Jim! We're free!" I yelled, only to find Jim was gone. I hollered and searched the woods, but it was no use. Old Jim had vanished. Distraught, I wandered the road and ran into a boy. I asked if he'd seen a runaway slave, and he said, "Yep, down at Silas Phelps's place, 2 miles below here. They got him. You looking for him?" I quickly spun a tale about being threatened by Jim and hiding in the woods. The boy relaxed and gave me the scoop. An old man had nabbed Jim and sold his claim for $40 since he had to leave. Jim was worth $200. The boy bemoaned his lost opportunity to cash in. Heart heavy, I returned to the raft and sat in the wigwam, trying to think. My head was sore from all the thinking, but no solution came. After all we'd been through, it was all ruined by those scoundrels who sold Jim back into slavery for $40 lousy. I toyed with the idea of writing to Tom Sawyer to tell Miss Watson where Jim was, but she'd sell him downriver out of sight, and I'd be shamed for helping a slave escape. My conscience gnawed at me, and I felt lower than low. I considered praying, but couldn't. My heart wasn't in it. You can't pray a lie, I found out. I wrote a letter to Miss Watson, telling her where Jim was, and signed it Huck Finn. I felt relieved, thinking I could pray now. But as I sat, I remembered all the good times with Jim. How he watched over me, saved my life, called me honey, and treated me like family. My resolve wavered. I looked at the letter, trembling. Then I tore it up. All right, then I'll go to hell, I said, making my choice. I decided to rescue Jim and go all in on wickedness. as long as it meant saving my friend. I set off for Phelps's place, hiding the raft on a nearby island. I put on my best clothes, sunk the canoe, and walked to town. On the way, I passed Phelps's sawmill and farmhouses, taking note of everything. In town, I ran into the Duke posting bills for the Royal Nonsuch. He was shocked to see me and asked about the raft and Jim. I spun another yarn about losing the raft while helping a man catch a sheep. The Duke looked troubled, realizing they'd lost both Jim and their money. He demanded 10 cents from me, which I gave, pretending it was all I had. He asked if Jim would betray them. "How can he? He's run off," I said. "No, he's been sold," the Duke admitted. I pretended to be devastated, demanding to know where Jim was. The Duke saw his chance to get rid of me. "Go see Abram Foster, 40 miles from here," he lied. I agreed, pretending to leave town, but doubling back to Phelps's farm to start my rescue plan. I knew the Duke was watching, but I outlasted him and headed into the country. As night fell, I made my way back to the sawmill and hid. Tomorrow I'd find Jim and we'd escape, leaving those frauds far behind.
Chapter 33. How to Crash a Family Reunion in Disguise and Other Adventures.
When I got there, it was all still and Sunday-like, hot and sunshiny, like an idyllic painting from hell. The field hands were gone, and the only company left were the bugs and flies, droning about like they had an important insect meeting to attend. If a breeze decided to show up, it would only serve to quiver the leaves and whisper ghostly nothings about your impending doom. It was the kind of place that made you wish you were dead, just so you could fit in with the atmosphere. Phelps's place was your run-of-the-mill one-horse cotton plantation. A 2-acre yard with a rail fence, some sad grass patches here and there, and a log house that had seen better days. The kitchen was another log cabin, connected to the main house by a roofed passage, presumably to keep the cooks from escaping. There were a few outbuildings, a garden, a watermelon patch, and then the cotton fields stretched out like a bad idea. I slipped in through the back stile, making my way toward the kitchen. As I got closer, I heard the haunting hum of a spinning wheel. If you ever needed a soundtrack to loneliness, that would be it. My spirits sank lower than a snake's belly in a wagon rut. I trudged on, hoping that Providence would gift me with the right words when the time came, because winging it had always been my style. Halfway to the house, the hounds started noticing me. One by one, they got up and began barking like I was a long-lost bone. Soon, I was surrounded by a chorus of canine alarm bells, all trying to outbark each other. A black woman came charging out of the kitchen, armed with a rolling pin and a voice that could command armies. She thwacked the nearest dogs, sending them yelping away. But a few came back, wagging their tails, trying to make friends. "Ain't no harm in a hound, nohow." And behind her was a parade of children, half of them white, half of them black, all of them curious and bashful. Then out came the white woman, looking like she had just won the lottery. She was all smiles and joy, and she ran to me like she had just seen the Messiah. "It's you, at last, ain't it?" she exclaimed, eyes glistening with tears. "Yes'm," I answered, before my brain could catch up. She grabbed me, hugged me, and shook me like a rag doll. Her eyes were waterfalls, and she couldn't stop saying how glad she was to see me. "You don't look as much like your mother as I reckoned you would, but law sakes, I don't care for that. I'm so glad to see you. Children, it's your cousin Tom. Tell him howdy." The children ducked behind her, fingers in their mouths as shy as rabbits. The woman continued, "Lize, hurry up and get him a hot breakfast right away. Or did you get your breakfast on the boat?" I lied about having breakfast on the boat just to avoid more attention. But she dragged me into the house and set me down in a chair, beaming like she'd just discovered the meaning of life. "Now I can have a good look at you," she said, holding my hands. "We've been expecting you a couple of days and more. What kept you? Boat get aground?" I was already inventing a story about a boat coming from New Orleans when she interrupted me saying, "Don't say yes'm, say Aunt Sally. Where'd she get aground?" I had no clue which bar we might have grounded on, so I pulled out a classic. It weren't the grounding. That didn't keep us back but a little. We blowed out a cylinder head. "Good gracious, anybody hurt?" No, killed a black dude. Well, it's lucky because sometimes people do get hurt. 2 years ago, last Christmas, your Uncle Silas was coming up from New Orleans on the old Lally Rook, and she blowed out a cylinder head and crippled a man. And I think he died afterward. He was a Baptist. She went on and on about Uncle Silas and his tragic boat stories, while I tried not to let my mind wander. I needed to find out who I was supposed to be, and fast. Then she dropped a bombshell. Snap! But here we're running on this way, and you ain't told me a word about Sis, nor any of them. Now, I'll rest my works a little, and you start up yourn. Just tell me everything. Tell me all about 'em, all every one of them, and how they are, and what they're doing, and what they told you to tell me, and every last thing you can think of. I was up a stump and good. No more improv for me. It was time to confess. But just as I was about to open my mouth, she yanked me behind the bed and whispered, "Here he comes. Stick your head down lower. There, that'll do. You can't be seen now. Don't you let on you're here. I'll play a joke on him. Children, don't you say a word." I was now officially in a fix. The old gentleman came in, and before I knew it, Mrs. Phelps was in a tizzy about her missing nephew. "Has he come?" she asked. "No," said her husband. "Goodness gracious, what in the world could have become of him?" And they were going back and forth, and I was getting nervous. Suddenly, she saw someone coming up the road and used that moment to yank me out from behind the bed. "Why, who's that?" asked the old man. "Who do you reckon it is?" she beamed. "I ain't no idea. Who is it?" "It's Tom Sawyer." I almost fell through the floor, but there was no time for that. They grabbed me, hugged me, and bombarded me with questions about Sid, Mary, and the rest of the fictitious Sawyer family. I spun a yarn that would have made Aesop proud. I told them more about my family than I knew about my own. Then, a steamboat coughed in the distance. I had a sudden realization. What if the real Tom Sawyer showed up? I had to intercept him. I made my excuses about fetching my baggage from town and set off, hoping I could waylay him before the truth blew up in my face. "Don't worry, Aunt Sally. I'll be back before you can say Huckleberry Finn," I said, making a dash for the road. As I sped away, the thought of the real Tom Sawyer walking in and blowing my cover kept me running like the devil was on my tail. If I could just intercept him, I might live to see another day.
This is the end of part 3 of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, reimagined in the style of best-selling author Kurt Vonnegut. If you are enjoying this classic book, Reimagined, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Classic Books Reimagined channel. Part 4, as well as the remaining episodes of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, can be found in the playlist. Thank you for listening. We will see you in the next episode.